And if we'd understood that, the Federal Reserve would not have put up interest rates as much as it's done to fight a cause of inflation that actually isn't there. I want to focus on just the level of inflation today, where it came from, and whether inflation is a good thing or a bad thing. The interview was right at the peak of the COVID inflation. At that time, all the debates were about whether it would be a permanent thing or transitory. It's turned out to be the latter, largely, but let's take a look at some of the causal factors after hearing this introduction.
The influential contrarian economist, Steve Keen.
Brilliant economist that criticizes much of modern economics.
A research fellow at the Institute for Strategy, Resilience and Security at University College in London.
He is someone that each and every one of us has to listen to, whether we agree or disagree.
Here's Steve Keen. Today we sit there's extremely high inflation. What role does inflation play in this picture? What's a little bit of inflation good or bad? A lot of inflation good or bad?
A little is good for a simple reason. If you think about how people say, what are the functions of money? They say money, it's a unit of account, so you're measuring. It's a means of exchange, okay, and it's a store of value. Let's now take a fast look at the issue of how prices are set, because one thing you'll get out of the mainstream, particularly Milton Friedman, is money is caused by, or inflation rather, caused by too much money chasing too few goods. This is an excerpt from my forthcoming book. What we've got, of course, just recently, we had a period of inflation which has risen quite seriously during the COVID crisis. It didn't reach anything like the levels we saw back in the 1990s of 12 to 15%, but it reached a peak of 9% in June of 2022, and that's pretty much when I was recording that interview with Lex. Now, if you look at how mainstream economists, neoclassical as they're known, and Austrian economists, they all come back and say inflation is caused by the government printing too much money chasing too few goods, and it's all the government's fault. So here we have Milton Friedman on this particular point saying that the government deficit and then prices, there'll be a long lag between them, but fundamentally what's going to cause inflation is government creating too much money. Let's have a look at that. So this is long and variable lags. This is a famous comment in economics which came out of this particular paper by Friedman called The Optimal Quantity of Money back in 1948. And he was really saying if the government runs too big a deficit, that's what's going to cause inflation. Okay. Well, let's take a bit of a look at that, but not from a neoclassical point of view, which starts with all sorts of assumptions, but something we can actually trace back to a Czech economist called Michal Kalecki. I hope I've got the nationality right. Czech or Polish economist. Thank you. My apologies to my Polish friends for that one. He argued that inflation was actually not something you contribute solely to the money creation, but to the social and technological issues in production. So he said, fundamentally, inflation is caused by a combination of three things. The markups that firms impose on their labor costs, the labor costs themselves, which are fundamentally the money wage rate, and the productivity per worker. And he worked it out in a very, very simple way, and I'll rapidly come down and show that here. So he said, if you look at what we call real GDP, which is the physical value of goods and services produced, that is actually derived from looking at nominal GDP and dividing by the price level. So we actually get data on nominal GDP. The numbers we see for GDP start off in being what goes through the till fundamentally, and that's the actual nominal value of GDP at a particular time. Then we calculate a price index, and that price index is calculated a number of sophisticated and complicated ways by stats. So we therefore separate out the price level, and then we divide that price level into the actual data we have on GDP in nominal terms and derive what we call real GDP. Now, that then lets you do a bit of algebra here, and I'll scan past it partly because I don't want to bore you all with algebra right now. But it comes down to the point where you can finally say that the price level is the markup corporations put on their labor costs and output per worker. So that's the overall framework, and it's just straight algebra. There's no real economic theory going in here. It's just an algebraic expression. Now, once you've got that, you can then decompose the rate of change of prices, and that's what the little hat there means, into the rate of change of all those three factors. And it then breaks out into the rate of change of markups, the rate of change of money wages, minus the rate of change of labor productivity. And what I've shown here is breaking that down for the period across the COVID bubble and so on. And I want to now go in and show in detail how I derive this particular chart and show it actually for the whole span of American economic history from 1790 forward. So just to give a bit of a prelude here, I'm going to show from looking at the data that yes, there was a large increase in the level of government spending during COVID. And without that, we would have a complete economic collapse, because with nobody able to go out and earn money, then you couldn't have paid your rents. But you couldn't pay the rents, the landlord would have gone bankrupt. That would affect the banks. We would have had a financial crisis like nothing in history. Instead, we got an inflationary period, and people often say the government created too much money, and that's what caused the inflation. Now, my punchline, which I might as well telegraph, because I'm going to be doing a fair bit of looking at statistics here to explain where the punch comes from. Take the National Rifle Association saying, guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, money doesn't cause inflation, people cause inflation. And you can look at that in three ways. The people who set markups, the people who set wages, and the productivity that comes out of the impact of COVID, as we saw on supply chains and so on. And when you decompose that, and I'm going to do the explanation here, you look at the rate of inflation, which is the black line there, and say, okay, what factors were above the rate of inflation during the period of COVID? You'll notice the green line, which is rate of change of money wages, that was higher than the rate of inflation from 2020 till about 2021. But after 2021, wages were rising more slowly than the inflation, and therefore effectively reducing the inflation rate, not increasing it. What actually increased the inflation rate was markups, rising much, much faster than the rate of inflation. When you look at the policy that the Federal Reserve has followed since, and central banks around the world, that policy assumes wages are causing inflation. And they think putting up interest rates, they can cause a decline in wage demands. But in fact, wage demands have not only been, this is nominal wages, have not only been below the rate of inflation since early 2021, they've actually been negative. Nominal wages have been falling across that period. Now, what I want to do is go and unpack that with a bit of data. And don't freak out when this comes up first on screen. This is my Ravel software again. I'm just going to zoom in and show bits of what I'm doing here. So there's a wonderful free website worth supporting. I think I do still support them financially, called measuringworth.com. So what they're trying to do is to do measures of GDP, consumer price index, wages in America, and they've got a range of other countries they're including in now, interest rate, exchange rates, and so on, but going back an enormous period of time, right back to 1790. So here's the GDP data, for example, and they can give you nominal GDP, real GDP, which of course is nominal deflated by the price index, population, GDP per capita, and real GDP per capita, right back to 1790, if you want to start there, and forward to 2023. And then they've also got data on annual wages, again, the same sort of time range here, and they've finally got information on the CPI. So it's a fabulous resource. It's very, very hard to find long-term data. This is one of the best sources of the whole thing. And another piece of data which I need to do the comparison I'm showing shortly is the level of debt, government debt. And this has moved around a bit in terms of websites. Is now the looks like the long-term location where this data will be available. So it's called fiscaldata.treasury.gov, and it's debt outstanding from 1790 through to 2023. And you can get a range of time ranges and different frequencies and so on. So what I'm doing with Ravel here, I'm pulling in the measuring net worth data on GDP, on CPI and wages. And then what I do with the Ravels here, and I'll just actually unpack this a bit further. This is the minimized version of the way we show the Ravel. And I hope you're not getting dizzy eyes from watching things zoom in and zoom out. Well, let's just actually go up here and I can show stored there. If I now put this in editor mode, then I've got nominal GDP in millions of dollars, real GDP in millions of 2017 dollars, the deflator, population, nominal GDP, etc., etc. All that stuff was shown in the web page I showed earlier. I can simply pull that all into Ravel, and then I can allocate that to GDP per capita and GDP in nominal terms. And what I do out of that is I roughly use GDP per capita as a measure of GDP per worker. And then I can say, well, what's the annual change in GDP per capita, divide that by GDP per capita itself, and put it through a percentage operator, and that gives me the change in the output to labour ratio in percentage terms. This is partly going towards deriving the argument you'll see statistically in a moment. Now, the same thing for the CPI. This is the Consumer Price Index. Take the annual change in the index, divide it by the index, put that through percentage operator, and you've got the annual rate of change of prices. I think that's easier to understand than the one line above, but it's basically the same operation. And then the same story for wages. Take in the wage data they have at the measuring net worth, look at the change in wages per year, divide it by wage, and that there gives you the annual rate of change of wages. Now, all that's being done because to derive Kalecki's equation about what causes inflation, I have to say, well, the rate of change of prices is the rate of change of markups plus the rate of change of money wages minus the rate of change of labour productivity. Now, as it happens, statisticians obviously record the rate of inflation. They obviously record the rate of change of money wages, though it's much, much harder to get that than it is to get inflation data. And you can also find rate of change of labour productivity. You can find those. What you can't find is the rate of change of markups. So what I do in Ravel, and I'll just zoom out a bit here, is say, well, if I've got this equation, so I know the equation here, and I know this, we've got data on this, data on that, and data on this, but not data on this one, then I can simply rearrange things and say the rate of change of the markup is the rate of change of prices plus the rate of change of labour productivity minus change in nominal wages. So having done all that, I then do that calculation in Ravel. So this is quite straightforward. And if I had data for every country in the planet, then this simple equation would derive the change of markups for every country on the planet. So there's the rate of change of prices, and there's 233 years worth of data on what I'm showing you in this particular Ravel. Here's this 233 years of rate of change of labour productivity and 233 years of rate of change of wages. And out of that, I can derive an implied rate of change of markups over the time period. So that's the whole, pretty much the whole of American history. So that's the long-term rate of inflation in America. And it's going right back from 1791 through to 2023. And this is the spike of inflation we all terrified about during COVID. Well, there was higher inflation back in the 1980s, and there was much higher inflation during World War I, and the highest rate of inflation was back in the 1860s. And you also, and one very important point to distinguish, and this comes back to the conversation I was having with Lex, we talk about inflation and deflation over time. Since the Second World War, there has almost never been a period of deflation. Okay? Whereas before the Second World War, there were periods where prices were falling by as much as 10% per annum. In fact, if you go right back to 1802, prices fell by almost 20% in 1 year. And incredible volatility as well, as you can see there. So let's now take a look at the causal factors here. So I'm going to put back in productivity and wages and markups into there. And now we can see what's moving dramatically at different times. And I want to now zoom in on the period of COVID inflation. And I can do that in Ravel by using what we call calipers, which are attached to the time dimension there. You can zoom it as much as you like and get an easy way to focus. So I'm going to slide the caliper along to the stage where I get to. I've just got the period from 2015 to 2023 and go back out again. What were the factors on an annual basis? The data I showed beforehand from my draft book was quarterly. What are the factors? And what you can see again during the COVID period is that generally speaking, wages were below the rate of inflation. This is annual data, so it's not quite as precise as quarterly data, and sometimes monthly we use to look at the different times. So with the monthly or quarterly data, occasionally wages poke their heads above the parapet and rose slightly faster than the rate of inflation. But throughout, what we see is markups have been rising faster than the rate of inflation. And some of the high periods of inflation were caused by declining productivity. This decline here is showing the impact of the original lockdowns and the supply chain disruptions that occurred and so on. So rather than rise in labour productivity, reducing the rate of inflation, when we had the COVID spike back in 2020, you had a decline in output per worker, and therefore we had actually contributed to inflation rather than reducing it. Then we fell back to the normal range here, where labour productivity rises were decreasing the rate of inflation rather than increasing it. But again, if you take a look at this period, the blue line is normally above the black line, and that means it's markups which are causing inflation, not wage rises. And yet the tools that the Federal Reserve are using are fundamentally directed at reducing wage inflation, not directing markups. They don't really understand it because they've never read Kalecki. They're neoclassical economists. They think about the economy as Milton Friedman is right, and unfortunately, well, fortunately, Milton Friedman was wrong. So the best people to look at in terms of inflation, not me, that's not one of the areas I specialise in, but I highly recommend the work of Blair Fix. And this is Blair Fix's website here called Economics from the Top Down. And what you can see he's doing here, and it gets to be quite complicated, he's decomposing the CPI into all the various goods and services that go into it and looking at which ones rise and which ones fall, and saying that predominantly what you've got going on is inflation is redistributing income from the poor to the rich. And that's one reason that workers suffered during the COVID period. But one of the arguments made by another prominent non-orthodox economist, Isabella Weber, about what causes inflation was again that it's markup based, and so what we should be doing is trying to control inflation not by interest rates but by reducing the capacity of firms to put up markups. And that might sound anti-democratic, but so is the capacity of firms to exploit the increase in money we saw during the COVID period by putting up their markups. But if you look at the deficit down here, it was actually quite small in historical standards, but that meant there was a large increase in money at the time of the COVID boom. And what this meant in Kalecki's terms, the extra money coming in to the things we actually spend on money on during the COVID period, meant that firms in those industries perceived a fall in the level of competition because goods were going out the factory door. It was easy to sell everything. Therefore, let's put the markup up because it looks like we can do that without denting the level of demand. So the money supply increased by the COVID deficits did contribute to inflation, but it did it by allowing the people who set markups to increase those markups. And markups have risen quite dramatically over the period from the 1960s to now. They've risen from, according to a neoclassical paper I've seen, from something like about 20% markup on costs to 60% markup on costs. So, and that's the major reason why workers' incomes have fallen so much. So that's just focusing on the very short term there. Let's just now go back into Ravel and extend it out so we go at the whole time period. I'm back here, and then we can see these periods of high inflation and say, okay, what caused it at different times? We noticed during the World War I period, wages exceeded the rate of inflation. Markups were falling and productivity was bouncing all around the place. That experience led the American government during World War II to say we don't want to see anything like the inflation we saw during World War I. So you had John Kenneth Galbraith, one of the great non-orthodox economists, appointed to a prices commission, which had this charge with trying to ensure that neither manufacturers nor unions took advantage of the incredible amount of money demand created by the deficits back then, which were huge. That's the deficit run by the American government during World War II. What I can do, I can now attach that to this chart so you can actually see that. So the scale of government spending during the Second World War reached about 40% of GDP, whereas the COVID inflation, or COVID increase in government spending is being blamed for the inflation now, was far smaller. And yet what you had was a relatively small increase in the rate of inflation compared to what had happened under the World War I period, when the government just basically let the market decide what was going to happen to prices. So you had massive inflation, damaging effect upon the economy, also upon the war effort. That lesson was learnt by America's governors back in the 1930s and 40s, so they set in place measures to stop the inflation they saw during World War I, and they were successful. So even though you had quite a substantial deficit, far more, about twice the deficit during World War II that you had during World War I, the increase in prices was about half. So that gives the lie to Milton Friedman's argument that it's always too much money chasing too few goods, and money creation alone will tell you what happens. The money creation during World War II was twice the scale of what was going on during World War I, but the inflation was about half. Now, by having forgotten the lessons that we learned between World War I and World War II, and by becoming obsessed with the ideological focus that neoclassical and Austrian economists have upon everything's the government's fault, so therefore that's what caused the inflation, we've lost sight of what actually does cause the inflation. So fundamentally, the cause of inflation in the post-war period, when you had trade unions would fluctuate, you can see, if I zoom in here, that money wages were rising faster than the rate of inflation in the 50s and 60s, whereas the markup, and the markup is the blue line, was often changing less than the rate of inflation. And then when we get to the COVID period, the inflation that occurred during the COVID period was fundamentally markups, not wages. So you need to decompose in a logically unimpeachable sense, in the fact that there's no ideology, no theory going in here. We're just decomposing which people can cause which parts of prices to change. And we find fundamentally the inflation during the COVID period was caused by markups increasing and labour productivity falling. Wages weren't part of the picture. And if we'd understood that, the Federal Reserve would not have put up interest rates as much as it's done to fight a cause of inflation that actually isn't there. Annoy a neoclassical devotee. Get my funny money bundle for free. I want you to see through the fantasies peddled by mainstream economists. They think they're leading us to economic equilibrium, but instead they've led us into economic and ecological crises. So pause this video now and join about 10,000 other truth seekers in downloading the Funny Money Bundle inside our WhatsApp community by going to new.stevekeenfree.com as well. It's free this week. Reveal what hides, expose the lies. New.stevekeenfree.com for the wise.